On my 70th birthday, my grandson pointed at the only empty chair and said, "Leave it, that's Grandpa's chair, the one no one uses." And they all laughed. I was in the next room, setting down the cake I had baked myself. They didn't know I'd heard. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care. That night, as candles flickered over a table filled with my blood and name, I sat in the shadows, close enough to smell the food, far enough to not be seen. My chair, as always, wasn't at the table. It was near the wall, a placeholder, a courtesy, maybe, when the family joked, "You're our little secret." It wasn't affection. It was dismissal disguised as humor. "Don't worry, Grandpa's used to being in the background. He likes it that way. He's simple like that." They thought I didn't mind. They thought silence was the same as peace. But silence can also be survival. I used to be the first one they ran to, bandaged their knees, paid their tuition, fixed their roofs. Now I'm the man they wheel out for photos and forget to wheel back in. They say I never became anything, that I worked just jobs, that I never owned a business, never published a book, never made a name. But what they never knew, what they never asked, is what I chose to bury, what I built in silence, what I held back, not because I lacked pride, but because I believed love didn't require receipts, until now. That night I saw the truth in their eyes, not hatred. Worse, indifference. And that's when I decided. Next time we gather, I'm not sitting near the wall. Next time they laugh, they'll choke on their certainty. And when I open the box they've never seen, they'll realize who really built this family story, and who they tried to erase from it. I found out about the party 2 days later. It was Mrs. Fletcher, my neighbor, who mentioned it, not out of malice, but confusion. "I saw all the cars outside your son's house," she said as she handed me my mail. "Looked like quite the event. Must have been little Oliver's birthday?" I nodded, pretending I knew, pretending it wasn't news, pretending my chest didn't suddenly feel like winter. I went inside and sat down slowly, the mail unopened in my lap. A birthday, my grandson, and no call, no message, no card, not even out of formality. I thought back to when he was born. I remembered the late nights pacing hospital hallways, the way my hands trembled when I first held him. I remembered driving 6 hours to pick up the exact crib my daughter-in-law had wanted, because the local store was out of stock. I remembered sanding it myself, making sure no edge could ever harm him. I remembered being needed. But now, there had been a party, a big one, with balloons, music, rented tables, and a private chef. I imagined the children running through the garden, the adults clinking glasses. I imagined my photo somewhere on the mantel, perhaps turned slightly to the side, as if even my picture didn't belong in the center anymore. I went to the garage that evening and opened a dusty drawer. Inside was the small hammer I used when laying the first post into the ground of that very house, the one they now filled with strangers and chefs and laughter I wasn't invited to hear. The ground was raw back then. I dug it with blistered hands. There were no architects, no landscapers, just me and a crude drawing on a napkin. I worked through rain, laid the pipes, measured the windows. I built the first fence with nothing but a borrowed saw and stubborn faith. The foundation under their party plates, I poured it. The studs holding up the room they danced in, I nailed them in myself. And yet somehow, the man who shaped the bones of that home was no longer worthy of standing in it. The ache wasn't just absence, it was being unneeded. It was the slow erasure, the soft exile that doesn't make noise but leaves bruises where no one can see. I didn't cry. I stopped doing that years ago when my wife passed. She used to say, "Our family won't always say thank you, but they'll remember." She was wrong. They forgot. And if that box under the floorboards had a voice, I think it would have whispered the same thing I now felt. You don't get to forget the man who built your shelter. So I didn't rage. I didn't beg. I just stood in the garage, my hand on the old hammer, dust in the air like ghosts. And I made a promise. Next time, I wouldn't wait for an invitation. Next time, I'd bring history with me and place it on the table they once left me out of. Friends, let me take a short pause here. Could you write in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story touches your heart, consider subscribing and sharing it. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to others. Now, let's continue. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to mean something. Family lunch, roast chicken, the smell of rosemary and bread in the air. I arrived early, I always did. Out of habit, perhaps, or hope? Maybe a quiet part of me still believed that coming first would mean I mattered. The door was slightly ajar, and I stepped in quietly, not wanting to startle anyone. The hallway was filled with voices, familiar, warm, casual. I moved slowly, not to intrude, just to listen for a moment. That's when I heard it. He can't even leave the grandkids anything. What's he holding on to? Old stories and broken tools? A pause. Then laughter. Soft, casual, cruel. It wasn't rage that rose in me. It was something quieter. A stillness. Like a light going out in a room no one's in. I stood frozen in place. I couldn't see who said it. I didn't need to. The voices were familiar. Voices that once called me hero, fixer, grandpa. Voices I carried on my back for decades. They didn't know I was there. Or maybe they didn't care. And maybe that was worse. I turned and stepped back outside. Slowly, silently. I walked down the driveway, my hands trembling. Not from age, but from something heavier. The weight of being measured and found, disposable. All my life I gave without asking. I chose not to impress, but to protect. They saw simplicity and mistook it for failure. They saw calloused hands and missed the inheritance buried beneath them. They looked at what I wore and never thought to ask what I once owned. They only saw the worn shoes, not the paths they had paved. That whisper wasn't just a sentence. It was a verdict. A quiet decision to place me in the past, like an old photo, kept for tradition but no longer looked at. I spent that evening alone, sitting on the back steps of my own home, a home I built nail by nail. The garden I planted stretched before me, but I didn't see it. All I could hear was the echo of that laugh, running over and over in my mind, like a child replaying a cruel joke they didn't know could bruise. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I opened the box again, the old one, and I held in my hands not money, not gold, but blueprints, contracts, letters, a legacy not yet revealed. Not because I needed validation, but because they needed reminding. And that whisper, that soft dismissal, became the match. The quiet spark that would light the story they tried to bury. That night, the wind howled against the windows like it had something to say, or maybe something to mourn. But inside, my house was still, too still. I sat in the kitchen for hours, unmoving, the clock ticking louder with every thought. Their laughter still echoed somewhere behind my ribs. The words, "He can't even leave the grandkids anything," had carved their place like a nail dragged across soft wood. But pain can only sit still for so long before it turns into something else. Resolve. Memory. Motion. I stood up. Without turning on the lights, I made my way through the back door, past the garden that had once been filled with little shoes and giggles, now quiet and overgrown. The air was cold and damp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones without asking. I reached the old shed. It was more than a place for tools. It was the first thing I built with my bare hands when we moved here. The door creaked open like it remembered me. Inside it smelled of oil, earth, and time. Dust hovered in the air like it was holding its breath. I knelt down. The wood beneath me was cracked and worn, but I knew exactly which plank to lift. The fourth one from the left, behind the stacked crates. My fingers found the edge, pried it up, a soft groan of old nails surrendering. And there it was, the box, rough wood, hand-carved, bound in an old cloth that had once been part of my wife's apron. It smelled like years gone by, like cedar, ink, and something else I couldn't name. Maybe hope. I didn't open it right away. I just stared. Because this box wasn't just storage. It was memory made solid. It was every sacrifice I never explained, every decision I never justified. It was the version of me they never bothered to see. Inside were deeds, blueprints, letters from old business partners, bank documents they never knew existed, photographs from when I stood beside men who now had parks named after them, sketches of the first delivery route I built from scratch, the one their company expanded but never credited. This box was proof, not for strangers, not even for them, but for me, that I was not a footnote, that I was never a nobody. I sat on the cold floor, the box in my lap like something sacred. The shed groaned in the wind, and I could almost hear my father's voice, rough and steady, saying, "Don't measure worth by applause, son. Measure it by what remains standing when everyone forgets your name." And I had remained, quiet, but standing. They thought I had nothing because I held it all quietly. They thought I was finished because I never announced I had begun. But this box, this was not just paper and ink. It was a key, and I had just decided to use it, not out of revenge, but because the story they wrote about me was wrong, and I owed it to myself and to the truth to rewrite it. Not with bitterness, but with weight, with legacy. And now the silence was over. I opened the box like one opens a wound, slowly, carefully, knowing what's inside might hurt, but needing to see it anyway. The papers were yellowed at the edges, curled with time, brittle like old memories. I lifted them gently, each one holding the weight of something lost. A blueprint of the first warehouse I helped design before the company had a name. A typed letter from a client thanking me for solving a logistics crisis when I was just the driver. I was never listed as a partner, never mentioned in the official stories. But the truth was in ink, my hands, my roots, my grit. But beneath the stack, folded into itself like something sacred, was a thick envelope, heavy, labeled in my father's careful, stern handwriting, "For my son if he remembers who he is." I sat there for a long while before I opened it. The paper inside was smooth, expensive, not the kind we ever used for daily matters. This had been prepared for something serious, something final. It was a will, signed, witnessed, dated decades ago. My father's estate, modest in assets but rich in land, was left entirely to me. Not divided, not conditional, except for one line. One single sentence written in ink that had slightly bled through the paper. He will receive everything if he does not forget who he is. And I hadn't. Not through the lean years, not through the long work weeks, not even when they called me a disappointment in polished words and tight smiles. I remembered who I was, a man who held others up even when they looked down on him, a man who kept his word even when no one kept theirs. But they had forgotten me, not all at once. It wasn't sudden like a slammed door. It was gradual, like erosion, like a shoreline pulled away grain by grain, until one day there's nothing left to stand on. At first I was too busy to notice, too busy providing, fixing, driving, sacrificing. Then I told myself it was just a phase, that they'd come around, that they were young. But now they were grown, with houses I helped finance, degrees I quietly paid off, marriages I gave my blessing to, even when I wasn't invited to the head table. And they didn't just forget me. They forgot where they came from. They forgot that the man in the corner chair once stood at the center, holding everything together. I closed the will and stared at the box again. This wasn't about inheritance, it never was. It was about legacy. About whether silence would erase me, or whether memory, if placed in the right hands, could restore what was broken. I placed the will back carefully, folded the letters again with reverence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was ready, because when they talked about family, they spoke of branches, parties, titles, vacations. But I had the roots, and the roots always remember. The phone rang late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to bend low over the hills. That hour always made me feel something quiet and tender, like the day itself was remembering things no one else would. I answered on the second ring. It was my niece. Bright voice, always cheerful, always careful in the way people are when they don't really know you anymore but still feel they should. "Uncle," she said, "we're organizing something really special next month. It's the anniversary of the company, 40 years. Can you believe it?" I said nothing. I remembered the first day it opened, not 40 years ago, but 43. I remembered the truck that broke down on that morning, and how I drove for 12 hours straight to make the first delivery myself, so the company wouldn't start its life with a failure. She kept speaking. "There'll be a big event, speeches, a media team, a commemorative video. We're collecting old photos. You probably have some from the early days, right? Maybe with Dad or Grandpa?" She paused. I could hear the hesitation. "And of course you're welcome to come too, but if it's too much, just sending us a few things would already be helpful." There it was, polite exclusion. An invitation disguised as a backup plan. She didn't want me there. She wanted my memories, without the man attached to them. I looked down at the box now resting on my coffee table, its contents carefully arranged, studied, remembered. Photos? Yes, I had photos. But I also had receipts, contracts, original designs. Plans with my handwriting still visible. I had signatures that started everything, and mine was the first one. They wanted nostalgia. But what I held wasn't nostalgia. It was truth. So I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said softly. "I have something better than pictures. She laughed lightly, unsure what I meant. Great, just send what you can. After the call ended, I sat in stillness for a long while. The house was quiet, but I felt no loneliness, only a slow rising clarity. They had spent years building a version of history that edited me out. I had let them, thinking humility was a kind of strength. But there's a difference between being humble and being erased. This wasn't about being honored at an event. I didn't need applause or a printed program. But when history is rewritten in front of your eyes, and your name is left off the page, silence becomes surrender. And I had surrendered long enough. That evening, I took out the original charter of the company, signed in my father's kitchen with ink that had soaked into the wood. My name sat first. Not bold, but there, solid, undeniable. I took out the old employee lists, the ledger with my handwriting from the first year. I laid them beside the newer photos, the ones they had curated for image and branding, and side by side the contrast was stark. They had built a story, but I had built the foundation beneath it. And what I held in that box, it wasn't backup footage. It was the spine of everything they celebrated. So no, I would not send photos. I would not attend as an afterthought. When I arrived, I would come not as a guest, but as the beginning, and I would bring not just a story, but the proof that it was always mine to tell. The night before the event, the house felt heavier than usual. Not with fear. I had long made peace with the years I'd given. Not with anger. That too had faded after being ignored so many times it lost its fire. But with something else. A quiet weight that comes when you finally decide to speak, not to be heard, but to be known. I pulled out the suit from the back of the closet, the dark gray one I hadn't worn in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. A little tight around the shoulders, a bit outdated in cut, but clean, strong, honest, like the man I used to be and maybe still was. I pressed it slowly, carefully. Steam rose with each motion, as if peeling away the dust of silence I had worn far longer than this fabric. There was no one to help me. No one to say, "You look sharp, Dad," or "Don't be nervous, Grandpa." But I wasn't nervous. I wasn't going there to prove anything. I was going because the story had wandered too far from the truth, and if I didn't speak now, it might never find its way home. On the table lay the box. Old wood, frayed corners, but still solid, still carrying more weight than all the polished speeches they'd prepared. I opened it one more time, not to check, not to doubt, but to remember. Each document inside had been handled so many times in the past few days that the edges had softened. Not one of them was loud. Not one of them begged to be admired. But together they formed something unshakable. A quiet record of everything I'd built, given, designed, defended, even when no one clapped. The blueprint with my original routing system. The letter from the founder of a now global partner firm, thanking me personally. The draft of the warehouse layout I'd built on a napkin in a truck stop. Receipts, notes, signatures. Proof. Not of wealth, but of origin, of presence, of truth. I placed the contents carefully into a black leather portfolio, not the expensive kind, just one that lasted, like me. And then I sat, just for a while, letting the quiet hold me. I thought of my wife, how she would have adjusted my collar, run her hand along my arm, whispered, "You don't need a crowd to know who you are." She used to say that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you live through. I'd lived through much. Now it was time to show them what that looked like, not in bitterness, but in dignity. As the evening deepened into silence, I stood in front of the mirror, fully dressed. The reflection wasn't proud, but it was clear. A man whose story had been overlooked was about to step into a room that had forgotten him, and remind them not with anger but with evidence. I turned off the light, picked up the case, and placed it by the door, not because I needed them to clap, but because I needed them to see. Not who I had become, but who I'd always been. The hall was dressed in light and glass and pride. A grand celebration. 40 years of success, they said, a tribute to legacy, a tribute to family. But as I walked in, alone, steady, with my case in hand, I realized the room was more decoration than truth. Tables gleamed, waiters floated like dancers, laughter filled the air like perfume, easy, curated, rehearsed. No one noticed me at first. Some offered polite nods, the kind you give to someone you think used to matter. I was directed to a seat in the back, near the double doors, the kind of seat that says, "You're here, but please don't disturb the flow." I sat quietly as I always had. The program began. There were speeches, videos, a timeline projected across a massive screen. Names of founders, partners, investors, all celebrated. Stories told of the company's first big client, its first delivery truck, the humble beginnings. Humble beginnings. I leaned forward slightly, because what they called humble was actually mine. Then the host's voice changed. "And now," he said, "we'd like to take a moment to reflect on those who were there, at the very start, the unsung hands behind the scenes, those whose names may not always appear in bold, but without whom none of this would stand." A soft round of applause, not raucous, polite. A gesture. Then the lights dimmed, and the first slide appeared, not from their archive, from mine. They didn't know it yet, but I had submitted a new presentation through the assistant, who hadn't known better than to upload what I gave her, assuming it was from someone official. She wasn't wrong. The photo appeared, grainy, sun-bleached. Me, 40 years younger, crouched in the dirt, sleeves rolled, digging the first trench for the company's original storage shed. Sweat pouring down my back. No hard hat, no crew, just me and a shovel. A pause in the room. Then the next slide. Me again. Beside a wooden frame, the skeleton of what would become the first dispatch office. I was holding a plank steady, while another man nailed it down. That man, I knew, would later go on to be one of the celebrated visionaries of the brand. But the foundation was in my hands. The next slide. I was younger, thinner, holding a child in my arms. My son, standing in front of the first delivery van, the same one now displayed in their lobby as a symbol of beginnings. They had cleaned it, polished it, painted over the rust. But in this photo, the rust was real, the tires worn, and behind the wheel was me, slide after slide. Proof they had forgotten. Photos of meetings in my garage before there was even an office. Handwritten notes on delivery strategy? Me. Cooking for the first 3 employees because we couldn't afford catering back then. Me building shelves, fixing broken locks, driving hours in the snow to save a ruined order. Me, always there, not behind them. Beneath them, not silent, essential. The room grew quieter. Some leaned forward. Others shifted in their seats. Then came a photo that didn't just show. It said, a close-up of a document. The original founding agreement. 3 signatures. My father's, my business partner's, and mine. First, people turned. Now they began to look for me. I felt the weight of their gazes, slow and hesitant, as if they were seeing something they didn't know how to look at. Like a statue moved from a corner into the center of the room. Familiar, but suddenly important. And I sat still. Not smiling, not proud, just present, because this moment wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was balance. History had tilted too far to one side for too long. And this was the tilt correcting itself. One truth-filled image at a time. As the final photo faded from the screen and the lights rose, the room was no longer filled with comfortable laughter or polite applause. It had changed. The mood had shifted, as if history itself had walked in and sat at the head table. I stood. I didn't walk fast. I didn't command the stage. I simply stepped forward, the portfolio in my hands, worn at the corners, heavy with what had always been true. No one stopped me. Some recognized me only now, by the photos, by the silence. Others looked away. But all of them felt it. The weight of something they had not prepared for. Not a surprise guest. A foundation. I reached the podium where others had spoken before me, with rehearsed jokes, curated stories, sanitized versions of the past. I didn't need a speech. I had documents, and a memory that never let go. I opened the case and removed the paper carefully, the way one handles something fragile. Or holy. It was a copy of the original contract, not a photocopy, the original carbon-backed duplicate, faded at the edges but still legible. At the top, in bold script, "Private agreement, establishment of primary dispatch point, hand-signed." I held it up. "This," I said, voice quiet but unwavering, "is the contract you forgot." The room held its breath. "This document marks the agreement for the first distribution station," I continued, turning it slowly so the front row could see. "The one your entire logistics empire was built on. You called it temporary, a stopgap. You called it a favor from a family friend. But this," I tapped the paper, "was not charity. This was vision. Sacrifice, risk, mine." I laid it on the podium like a judge would place evidence. "And here," I took out a folded page, a rough pencil sketch on yellowed graph paper, "are the original layouts, storage flow, loading dock orientation, optimized by vehicle size, hand-drawn in my garage. Not by consultants, by a man who had driven the routes himself. Eyes were wide now. Some of the younger ones whispered. I heard someone say, "Is that real?" Another, "But I thought it was Uncle Martin who—" But Martin hadn't drawn the plans. Martin had once laughed at me for using a pencil instead of software. I continued. Your success was not born in a boardroom. It was born in dirt, in calloused hands, in nights where I slept in the back of a truck so the morning shipment wouldn't be late. You built the company. Yes, but you built it on this. I touched the papers again, slowly, deliberately, like reclaiming something no one else could touch. In the public story, I'm not there, but the ground beneath your celebration knows my name. The cement remembers my weight. The beams remember my hammer. And then I said it, not in anger, but in truth, the kind of truth that leaves no room for denial. You've celebrated architects, but forgot the man who carried the bricks. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply stood, and that, in a room built on omission, was louder than anything they had planned. Somewhere near the front, I saw one of the executives, young, confident, polished, lean toward my son and whisper something. But my son didn't respond. He just stared at me, not with defiance, but with the dawning expression of someone realizing they'd forgotten to ask the most important question of their life. Who was my father, really? And now he was starting to remember. The room had settled into a silence no microphone could break. Not the kind of silence that follows a mistake, or a joke that didn't land, but the kind that follows a reckoning, where people realize they've been standing on a story they didn't write and didn't bother to read. I reached once more into the case. This time I didn't pull out contracts or photographs. What I held was thinner, lighter in weight, but heavier in meaning. A letter, folded 3 times, the creases deep, soft from years of being opened, reread, held. The paper was thick, handmade with a rough edge. It had yellowed gently with time, but the ink was dark, bold. My father always pressed hard when he wrote, as if he needed his words to be carved, not written. I held it in both hands. It wasn't addressed to the company. It wasn't meant for a crowd. It was addressed to me, only to me, in a handwriting I hadn't seen in decades but would have known with my eyes closed. My son, if you're reading this, it means you remembered. It means you carried not just the name, but the weight of it. It means you chose character over comfort. It means you never let money bleach the blood from your hands. You are the story I was too tired to write, the one I hoped would outlive me. Do not let success blind you to the face of sacrifice. Do not let applause drown out the sound of honor. Let them forget the titles, the property, the fortune, but never let them forget what our name stood for. Quiet work, clean hands, a spine that doesn't fold. I paused. The paper trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from memory. Then I read the last line aloud. For the first time, not just to myself, but to the world. If you are reading this, you have kept the honor of our blood. Now protect it, even if it means standing alone. I folded the letter slowly, precisely, like it deserved. When I looked up, I didn't tremble. Not anymore. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not wondering if I had done enough. I knew. I had carried the name when no one else remembered it meant something. I had stayed when others sold, given when others took. And now I had spoken, not for revenge, not for recognition, but to remind a room of what legacy really is. Not profit, not celebration, but truth, kept alive when it was most convenient to forget. They looked at me differently now, not like a relic, but like a root, and I stood there weathered and steady, exactly as my father would have wanted. He stood slowly. My son. Tall, presentable, gray at the temples now, just like I once was. He adjusted his jacket, a nervous motion he must have learned from watching me all those years ago. His mouth opened, but no words came at first. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he no longer knew what he was looking at. A father? A stranger? A chapter he had skipped, now reading itself aloud? His voice was quieter than I expected. Why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. Not angry, not accusing, just lost. Why didn't I tell them? Why didn't I show the letters sooner? The photos? The contracts? The weight I carried so they didn't have to? I looked at him. Not with bitterness, not with pride, but with the quiet ache of a man who had once believed love didn't need reminders. And then I said it, the only thing that could be said, because you never asked. You only judged. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we never said across so many dinners, so many years, so many opportunities. I remembered birthdays where I sat alone in the corner, barbecues where I was given the folding chair, conversations where I was always talked at, never spoken with. I remembered when I handed him the keys to his first car, the one I'd fixed up quietly over months. He said thanks, but never asked how I did it. Never wondered what I gave up to make sure he had what I never did. He sat back down slowly, but it was more than just sitting. It was collapsing, as if something inside him had come undone. I watched his eyes, not wet with tears, but with something heavier. Recognition. The unbearable weight of memory returning with truth attached. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. There was no sense of, now you see, only grief. Because this understanding had come too late. And not because time had run out, but because he had chosen not to look until now. We were two men sitting across decades of silence. One finally speaking, the other finally hearing, but the space between us still wide. He reached for the letter I had folded, not to take it, just to touch it. His fingers hovered, then pulled back as if afraid it might burn. And maybe it did. Maybe the truth has a heat to it when you've ignored it too long. Around us, no one spoke. The room was still full of guests, full of family. But it felt like we were the only ones there, father and son. One with answers he never wanted to weaponize, the other with questions he never had the courage to ask. And in that moment I realized he didn't rise to defend me. He rose because the foundation beneath him, the one he thought he stood on, had just shifted. And he didn't know what to do with the truth, that I had been holding him up the entire time. The moment hung in the air like a snapped wire, tense, charged, impossible to ignore. My nephew, the one who always championed modern methods and dismissed my work as relics of a bygone era, rose from his seat with deliberate slowness. His face was ashen, lips pressed tight, eyes darting between the contracts laid bare on the podium and the guests whose applause had dissolved into stony silence. He walked out without a word, his chair scraping softly against the floor, a sound that echoed louder than any shout. In that instant, the grand hall felt hollowed, as if his departure had taken half the ceiling with it. He had built his reputation on buzzwords and PowerPoint slides, gleaming charts that promised innovation, while erasing the very hands that dug the first trenches. Tonight, he discovered that his polished career stood on my rough sketches, on documents he once sneered at when he called me outdated. People turned to watch him go, some with curiosity, others with shame, but no one called him back. The applause never returned. It was as though the truth had swallowed the festivities whole, leaving only the raw edges of reality. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the tremor in my chest settle into a deep sorrow. This was more than embarrassment. It was a reckoning. My nephew's exit wasn't just a rejection of me. It was the collapse of the false narrative he had helped build. He could no longer thrive on a legacy rewritten by omission. When the door clicked shut behind him, I opened my eyes. The room had shifted, repositioned around a new center of gravity. I was no longer the overlooked elder in the corner. I was the pivot on which their history turned. The nephew's absence was a testament. You cannot wage progress on borrowed pillars. In the silence he left behind, I felt the weight of their stares converge on me, not with pity, but with a tentative reverence. And as I gathered the portfolio once more, I understood that some departures herald the arrival of truth at last. After the lights dimmed and the projector cooled, after the clinking glasses turned into silence and the waiters began quietly folding linens, they came, one by one. Faces I had known since they were children, now aged, accomplished, powdered with success and polished manners, began to walk toward me. Their pace was slow, uncertain, like people approaching a gravestone they forgot to visit. They came not with flowers, but with words. I had no idea. You should have said something. We're so sorry. Their hands were warm, firm. Some held both of mine. Their eyes tried to speak louder than their mouths, wet with embarrassment, rimmed with shame. I nodded politely. I did not pull away. I let them speak, but I said very little in return. Because I had learned something long ago. Real apologies don't come with speeches. They come with change, and there was none yet. Only words. So many words. Words that might have meant more if they had come when I was sitting alone at family dinners. Words that might have softened the silence when I was left off invitation lists. Words that would have made a difference before I had to bring proof. Now they felt like confetti after a storm, fluttering, too late, too light. My niece kissed me on the cheek. My cousin placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You're the reason we're all here." My older brother looked at me for the first time in years with something close to awe, and still I remained quiet. because what I had brought wasn't meant to inspire guilt. It was meant to restore truth. And truth, once revealed, doesn't beg for recognition, it stands. They said they admired me, that they were proud, that I had taught them something tonight. But I didn't want admiration. I had never needed it. I had needed presence. I had needed memory. And neither of those had been offered when it mattered. Now they handed me words like bouquets handed to a man who already buried the seeds. I stood there holding a folder. But what I really held was the full weight of everything I had given in silence. Now finally acknowledged, but not yet honored. I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I just waited to see if their hands would do more than shake mine, to see if their eyes would do more than flicker with remorse. Because forgiveness isn't found in sentiment. It's found in how you carry someone once you realize you nearly let them disappear. And until then I listened, but I did not answer. A week after the event, the house was still quiet. No new phone calls, no grand gestures, just a few letters left in the mailbox, mostly thank you cards, written with good intentions but hollow in weight. I didn't expect more. But there was one thing left to do. Not for them, for the ones still becoming, the ones with time, the ones who still listened with eyes wide open because the world hadn't yet taught them to close their hearts. I called my grandchildren, all of them. They came on a Sunday afternoon, arms full of questions, unaware of the heaviness behind my invitation. Some ran ahead to hug me. Some stayed near the door, older now, caught between screens and obligations, but they all came, and that was enough. I waited until the room settled. No distractions, no music, no television, just the hush of something about to matter. Then I brought out the box. Not with ceremony, not with drama, just care. The same box I once pulled from beneath the old floorboards. I set it down on the table. They leaned in, curious, expectant. Not for money. They didn't know what this box meant. They just felt the weight of it, and somehow the weight of me. I opened it slowly. Inside were all the things they'd never seen. Faded documents, maps, letters, sketches, receipts, my father's handwriting. Mine. No gold, no keys to some hidden fortune. And yet, this was the inheritance. They waited for me to speak. But I let the silence do the first part, because sometimes truth needs stillness to land. Then I looked at each of them. Not as children, but as future bearers of a name that had been both forgotten and reclaimed. I didn't tell them the story again. They had heard parts of it already. And what I said was this. Everything in this box is paper, ink, memory made visible. But your real inheritance isn't here. It's not in the signatures or the sketches. It's in how you treat those who came before you, when no one's watching. It's in whether you choose silence or dignity when the world looks away. It's in how you protect the unseen, the ones who built without needing to be applauded. What you carry forward isn't these documents. It's your name, your word, and the truth you defend, even if it makes the room uncomfortable. They didn't move. They didn't interrupt. One of the younger ones, my granddaughter, maybe 11, reached out gently and touched a folded letter, not to take it, just to feel it. She looked up at me and whispered, "Did you build all of this?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "I carried it long enough for you to." The others were silent. Some shifted. One boy blinked fast like he wasn't sure why his chest felt tight. But no one reached for their phones. No one rolled their eyes. And that silence, that listening, meant more than any applause I had received in that grand hall. Because here, they didn't see me as forgotten. They saw me as foundation. And for the first time, I believed the story would not be lost again. Not because I told it louder, but because they finally heard it. The rain came soft that morning, like the sky itself had decided to move slowly, gently, giving the world space to breathe. I sat at my desk near the window, the old box resting quietly beside me, like a companion that had nothing more to prove. The wood was worn smooth now from so many hands, mine, my father's, and now the hands of those who might still remember. The pen felt heavier than it used to, or maybe my hands just understood better what ink could carry. I opened the folder of documents, the contracts, the titles, the shares, and began making the changes. Not out of spite, not out of punishment, but out of clarity. I removed the names that had only returned when the spotlight did. I kept my son's portions fair, modest, enough for them to live comfortably, respectfully, but not enough to inherit without understanding. Then I turned to the final page, the section titled Custodianship. It had always been blank. I had never known who would be worthy of carrying what this family truly meant, until now. One by one, I wrote the names of my grandchildren, in full. No middle initials, no abbreviations. because they would not inherit money. They would inherit memory, responsibility, the quiet duty of protecting a story that had nearly been lost, not because it disappeared, but because no one thought to ask where it began. I left them not vaults, but truth, not a throne, but a compass. And then I turned to the box. I took a small brass plate, the kind my father used to nail into the side of wooden crates, and etched 5 words into it with a slow, deliberate hand. Not a treasure, a reminder. I screwed it onto the front of the box myself. It gleamed softly in the morning light, catching the reflection of the past and casting it forward, not backward. Then I stood. I placed the revised documents in a separate envelope, sealed it, and wrote in firm letters, "To be opened when memory fades, and truth must rise again." I set it beside the box, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. Closure? No. Something better. Peace. Not because everything had been fixed. Not because those who forgot had suddenly remembered, but because I had finally spoken, not for revenge, not to shame, but to restore. I didn't rewrite the history to erase theirs. I rewrote it to include mine, to place the missing beam back beneath the house, to restore the name they had dusted over, to remind them that legacy is not passed down in titles, but in the quiet strength of those who built without needing to be seen. And from that day forward, no one called me a nobody again, not because I made them fear me, not because I demanded respect, but because I had reminded them, with quiet hands and steady truth, who I had always been. Not a relic, not a burden, not a ghost in the corner, but the man who gave them the roof they stand under, and the name they carry, even when they forget where it came from.